Stevens, can you hear me? Good. Well, thanks so much, Matt. Thank you for that fine introduction. And first of all, I want to say how sorry I am that this issue has beset your community, because I've been watching wind development across the state since 2008 when I was a planning commissioner. And we try mightily not to let the division creep in, but it creeps in. And I've yet to find a solution to that. Finding a way to site wind turbines in a community in a way that everybody's at peace with them is so far proven to be elusive. I don't make the facts, I just report them. But that's my observation has been. I've been in meetings like this and in hearings all across the Midwest, to North Dakota, Missouri, Illinois, Kentucky, Ohio, Michigan, and it's always rooms full of people like this. And in my township, 6 years after our vote on our wind ordinance, we still drive through our township and see, instead of Joe, Bob, Ed, and Frank, we see 4 against, 4 against. That's lamentable. That's an unintended consequence of the 15% RPS. So I won't drone on too much, but I'm the former vice chairman of the Riga Township Planning Commission. I got a degree from the University of Michigan. Of course, so did the Unabomber. And it does look like our slides are going to be cut off on the left-hand side, and I may be powerless to fix that. That's really too bad. We helped create a zoning ordinance in 2011 that was added to a list of state model wind zoning ordinances. We're pretty proud of that. I'm not a lawyer, but I do watch Law and Order. I'm not offering you legal advice today, so I recommend strongly that you retain competent legal counsel as you create wind generation zoning ordinances. Boy, this is really going to be frustrating if we can't get this to format on the screen. But yeah, I don't know what happened to it, but we lose the whole left side of the discussion.
Try zooming it down to 75%.
Oh, you mean? Well, we're going to have to live with it. Matt made a very good point at the very beginning. He said that we don't want this to be a debate about whether wind energy is good or noble or renewables and so forth are wonderful. The wind industry wants this to be a debate about whether or not wind energy is good and the benefits for your community are fantastic. The truth is, all this is about from a zoning perspective is that you have tall, noisy structures that need to be situated somehow in a community that's also filled with human beings living in residences. I don't care if those tall, noisy structures extract oil from the ground, suck coal out of the ground, produce electricity, or turn sow's ears into silk purses. None of that matters from a zoning perspective. We have tall, noisy structures, and we have to accommodate those in the community in a way that protects health, safety, and welfare. So that's the, are we?
Tried resyncing it, but it didn't work. So
Oh boy.
we started using stations.
Foiled by the fickle finger of fate. All my worst nightmares are coming true in front of my eyes. Okay, we're going to live with that. Our whole purpose as planning commission members, hopefully some of you are, but as citizens you need to understand that the whole purpose of zoning is to separate conflicting uses of ground. Zoning got started in the Euclid decision 100 years ago. Meatpacking plants built up alongside residences. That's when the Supreme Court decided the communities can decide for themselves how to separate uses that we recognize are not compatible with each other. And if you're a township board member or a planning commission member, I've sat at the other side of the table. I know what it's like to have a room full of people like this, each having claims on their own private property rights. The thing is, if you adopt my approach to zoning for wind energy, that pressure can be removed from your township government or your county government and placed back into the hands of private people as they negotiate the value of their loss of amenity with the wind contractor on an equal footing basis. That's a lot to say up front. As we get through it, I think it will become clear. I think that zoning regulations that work with the principles of consent and compensation are the fairest way to handle these land use policies. Remember, the wind is unlike any other land use. If I'm coming to site a gas station in your community, maybe the whole township might need one or two, and they're only going to affect 1 or 2 acres, maybe, something like that. Wind energy requires dozens, if not hundreds of turbines covering multiple townships. It's hard to separate the conflicting part of the uses when they take so much space. But that's not our fault. The wind industry demands that we try and accommodate a size 12 foot and a size 9 shoe. No other land use requires that big of a wholesale change in land use policy. And I just want to say, we're a bipartisan group. I'm not paid to be here tonight. I donate my time. We do receive donations that can help offset my travel expenses. We are not a right-wing or left-wing group. We have a lot of Democrats involved with us. My attorney buddy who helps me on this stuff, he and I can't talk about Donald Trump at all. He's a left-winger. I'm on the right. Not that I'm a huge Trump fan by any stretch. My point is, we're bipartisan, and the thought is often circulated that we're some dark right-wing conservative group trying to stop wind. I can't stop wind projects. I don't vote in your township. I don't elect your officials. I don't even have the power to stop wind projects. But the wind industry becomes offended with me because I educate communities about their rights under the Michigan Zoning Enabling Act. And they would prefer that you didn't know what those rights were. So, the wind industry, like I said, wants to talk about all the wonderful blessings that come with wind instead of just talking about health, safety, and welfare. I would rather not talk about anything but properly siting turbines. But after 9 years of watching the wind industry at work in the state, all their advertising, everything goes talking about lease payments, tax revenue, and all the financial benefits that come from this project. As well as sometimes they talk about energy and getting off fossil fuels and issues like that. Because that's where they spend most of their time in the debate, I have to respond to some of those macroeconomic issues. Because the second I talk about health, safety, and welfare, they're going to say, yeah, but we're going to employ 12 people, and therefore we're going to trump everybody's private property rights in exchange for those 12 jobs. I don't think that's a fair trade-off. So let me address some of the macroeconomic concerns that you should all have as Michigan ratepayers. First of all, Michigan's wind is not competitive at all. This is a wind map of the state of Iowa. This is a wind map of the state of Michigan. Purple and light purple are the most desirable wind in the country. There's none in the state of Michigan. In fact, if you look closely, you'll see that Michigan's best wind, which is cut off on the right-hand side, is in the tip of the thumb. Our best wind is Iowa's worst. What that means in real terms is we're paying $60 a megawatt hour or more for wind energy in Michigan, and they're producing it in Iowa and selling it for only $20. Every wind turbine that would get stuck here in the ground in Ingersoll Township would produce twice as much electricity simply by locating it in Nebraska, Oklahoma, Iowa, Minnesota. And it's reflected in our contract prices. Again, it's very sad that this is cut off, but this red bar is Michigan's energy, wind energy contracts, and it turns up sharply here. Detroit Edison's latest project in Pine River Township in Gratiot County just jumped up from $45 from the thumb pricing to $60 in Gratiot County in southern Isabella because the wind is so poor. That project has the distinction of being the most expensive wind contract of 2016 in the United States. It was very uncompetitive. And the wind industry and the MPSC talks about how our wind projects are getting cheaper and cheaper, starting at $104, dropping down to $50. But here's what those contracts are selling for out west, $17, $18, $21. Now let's talk about the social cost of carbon. We often talk about CO2 emissions. Some people are very concerned about that. The IICC, my group, we're agnostic. But the harm, the economic harm from CO2 emissions was valued by the Obama administration at about $40 per ton of CO2 emitted. That's the harm to the economy as a whole. Unfortunately, MISO, our grid operator, did an analysis of wind generation in the Midwest and found out that it does reduce CO2 emissions, but at a price of $237 per ton. So we're spending $237 per ton to offset a harm of only $40. It doesn't make a lot of sense. So we're back to comparing the tip of the thumb with the wind resources in our area here. So it leaves an obvious question. Why here? Why is anybody trying to build wind in this part of the state? And you're not alone. They're in Bay County, they're in Lapeer, they're in St. Clair, they're in Branch County down on the state line. Very poor wind resources, even by Michigan standards. Well, there's a little history. For years, Detroit Edison and other wind companies have run wild in Huron County. A lot of reasons for that, I'm not going to go into detail, but they have more wind turbines in Huron County than any other county this side of the Mississippi except for Benton County, Indiana. But yet Huron County has 4 times the population. Last year, 3 townships, and those are the yellow ones, faced even more wind development by NextEra and Detroit Edison. There's an interesting point. Lincoln Township is an unzoned township under county rule zoning. And 4 of those 5 Lincoln Township trustees have leases with Detroit Edison. So if the project were to get constructed, they would get the big checks, right? You normally would say conflict of interest. They're going to shove this project through. They didn't. They sent a letter to the county asking them to not approve a new project in their township. They said, we feel that Huron County has done our part as far as green energy. We feel that no additional turbines should be allowed in Huron County. That's because they look out their window and know what 450 turbines look like. And despite the fact that they were going to get the big checks, they did the noble thing and said no. Ultimately, what they did was took back their zoning. So we had big, nasty referenda taking place all across the thumb in May. 2 countywide zoning referenda on these overlay districts and 2 township-level zoning referenda on the May ballot. The campaign was very intense. It started with the absurd. DTE sent Trevor Lauer, the CEO of DTE Electric, not the DTE Corporation, trying to get the votes to get this project approved in Huron County. And they sent a letter, which sadly is cut off, but it says, look, we know some of you are concerned about the number of turbines in Huron County. Let us just assure you, if you give us just 1 more, we will never build any more again. Why would you promise not to build any more of something that they regularly tell everybody is a tremendous blessing? You got menacing. This flyer went door to door. Why is this lawyer smiling? Vote no on May 2nd. A PAC supporting NextEra's effort basically said, if you vote against us on this taking back your zoning issue, we're going to sue you. That's what their campaign strategy was. Vote against us, we will sue you. And they have been suing in Tuscola County. They lost the first round. The residents fought back. Pickets, protests, the whole thing. The campaign disclosures revealed that the DT and NextEra together spent $875,000 in PR trying to win that election. The folks spent $3,700. But money didn't do it this time. All 4 of the votes broke against the wind companies 2-1, and in fact in Sand Beach Township it was 85 to 15%. And losing at the ballot box is not rare. This is a list of The proposed Ingersoll regulations, for your reference, now show 1.5 times the height setback to roads, 2,000 foot setback to unleased property lines, 499 foot height limit, 1,400 foot setback to other homes, and 30 hours of shadow flicker. So that's your frame of reference. And the noise regs as proposed are here. I'm sure if you need a copy of these, you can get them from the Ingersoll Township Board or Planning Commission. Let's talk about height. In general, communities are free to regulate the height of structures in any way they see fit. For instance, we regulate houses often to 25 or 35 feet. I'm a builder by trade. Many communities have a 35-foot height limit on houses. Is that because 40-foot or 50-foot houses can't be built safely? No. You just decided we didn't want to see anything taller than this. We often regulate the height of church steeples. Even antennas and leg elevators and all manner of things have regulations applied to them. It's not because taller structures are unsafe necessarily that you set a limit, you just don't want to see them. We do this to billboards all the time. We regulate the size, we regulate the location, we regulate the lighting, because they tend to look like blight if they're done improperly. And even wind developers recognize that wind turbines have an effect on visual impact. One of the DTE vice presidents said this in a podcast in Traverse City. He says, certainly there are some pristine places in Michigan where you don't want to impact the viewshed. You take a situation like Leelanau County or the old Mission Peninsula here in our region. Certainly there are areas where, while it would make perfect economic sense and perfect placement for utility turbines, we probably don't want them as a region there. Apparently, Huron County does not meet their definition of pristine. Curiously, wealthy parts of the state along the west coast by Sleeping Bear, where the resort money is, they adopted very restrictive wind zoning regulations many years ago with no protest, no argument. It's the rural areas like us where it becomes like this. But the people who profit from these developments often live in those protected regions along the lakes. So, back to our question, how tall do you want your turbines to be in your community? Just like any other land use, it's up to you. How tall do you want? 200 feet? By the way, somebody say height limit's too short or exclusionary zoning. In a case called Janacek versus Bay Township, the courts upheld a 30-foot height limit for wind turbines. They said it's exclusionary. The judge says you can build all the 30-footers you want. It can't be exclusionary. So now let's take a quick look at setback distances. How close is too close? I know somebody else is going to talk about this briefly, but two safety manuals from Vestas and Nordex, large turbine companies, have statements about 500-meter distances. One is in the event of a fire. If the thing catches fire, run away 500 meters. That's 1,640 feet. If the brake fails and there's an overspeed event, again, run away. So 1,640 feet seems like a reasonable number based in science. Curiously, Detroit Edison has been robocalling and telling people in Beaver Township that there's no scientific basis for the 1,640-foot setback. I didn't write the owner's manual. Here's a 1,500-foot debris field from a 390-foot turbine that shattered. They seem to have some understanding of what the possible debris field could be when they write the regulations, or their safety manuals. Another thought, something that should be added to your ordinance. Because people have been referring to these safety manuals and those large distances in them that are not very amenable to wind development, if you ask the wind company to give you the latest operations and maintenance manual or safety manual for the turbines they intend to build in your community, they will not give them to you. They claim it's a proprietary trade secret. Huron County, Michigan presently has a safety manual in their planning board that their planning commissioners cannot see unless they agree to sign a non-disclosure agreement. I would say put it in your ordinance and tell them you want to see it as part of the application. How can you make sure you're protecting health, safety, and welfare if they won't reveal to you everything that's in the book about protecting people from the bad things that can happen with a wind turbine? Despite stuff like the 1,640-foot evacuation radius they talk about, wind developers are still demanding 1,000 to 1,400-foot setbacks from houses, not property lines. By demanding that the setback distances, and this is a key point, but when the wind industry demands that the setback distances be measured from the house of an unleased property rather than the property line, which is typical of all other zoning regulations. Go through your zoning book, you'll see all the setback distances are from the property line, except wind. What they have really asked your zoning board to give to the wind company is an easement. An easement across unleased private property, a safety and nuisance easement. And I think that's fundamentally unjust. We're finding that there are people with wind leases in other parts of the state that when they hear this discussed, it's before the projects are built, they said, you know, I wanted the turbine money, but that's not right. Setback should be measured to the property line. It's curious, the wind companies push back against me and say, well, it's not an easement. But if you sign their lease, listen to what they call it. An effects easement. Owner grants to operator a non-exclusive easement for audio, visual, view, light, flicker, noise, shadow, vibration, air turbulence, weight, electromagnetic, electrical, and radio frequency interference, and any other effects attributable to the wind farm or activity located on the owner's property or adjacent properties over and across, etc., etc., etc. 2 points about that. When you sign a lease with them, it's an easement. But if your zoning board gives you that easement for free, they don't want to call it an easement. Secondly, they just listed a long list of things that wind turbines can do that they will often tell you don't really happen. Well, if they don't ever happen, why are they in their lease? So let's take a look at what this looks like, this setback. The developers will recommend something between 1,000 and 1,320 to a house, sometimes a little more, but not much. Even though the manufacturer's evacuation zone says something about 1,640 feet, or perhaps bigger with bigger turbines. Got a farmer here with no contract and a farmer here with one. Now, even if you move the 1640 back to the house, which is what I think they've done in Huron County now, you see this semicircle still has this evacuation zone across this unleased property. A place where you might want to build a house for your daughter who's going into the farm business. A place where you want to put the swings for the kids. It's the property you pay taxes on, right? Those future development rights are given to the neighboring farm, but not even to the neighboring farmer. To the neighboring farmer's tenant, because the wind company's just renting their ground. By moving, at bare minimum, the evacuation zone to the property line, at least you can safely build on your parcel next door. You'll say, well, Mr. Martis, this is an exaggeration. Does this really happen that often? Well, here's an Exelon wind map from Bridgehampton Township in Sanilac County. Green parcels are leased, gray parcels are not leased. I'm going to zoom in. Here's the 1320 setback distance. And if you look at this fellow's farm in the middle, you can see that roughly 50% of that guy's farm is now inside the safety setback, or the setback distance. That doesn't strike me as fair. Oliver Wendell Holmes, former Supreme Court Justice, said it this way: the right to swing my fist ends where the other guy's nose begins. That's the limits of your private property rights. My corollary says, if my development project requires me to repeatedly punch you in the nose, then at bare minimum, I should get your consent and compensate you for your broken nose. The express goal of all zoning, as I mentioned already, is to separate conflicting uses of land from each other. By establishing setbacks and noise limits from neighboring homes, rather than the property lines, the conflicting use is actually granted legal access to the neighboring property without consent or without compensation. This is fundamentally unjust. Curiously, a New York court now agrees with me, almost quoting some of my stuff verbatim. The setbacks, the judge says, are in reality set-offs, commencing at the point of the wind turbine's location and then set off 1,750 feet from there. The property then of the non-participating landowner is in effect taken by this governmental action without compensation or consideration. The non-participating landowner's property is therefore adversely impacted by the location of the wind turbines as developments of a use other than agriculture is curtailed. So the courts are finally catching up with something I've been talking about since 2010 or 11. So what's the right setback distance? I would say if your ordinance is to regulate setbacks for safety like fire or rotor failure, then 1640 to a property line for a 500-foot class turbine is a bare minimum. That seems reasonable. If you're going to use distance as a proxy for noise regulations, because enforcing noise regulations for wind turbines turns out to be very expensive and takes years, you may just say, well, heck, we'll just put big distances in and let that work because the noise part of the protection, then maybe 1.25 miles setback might be reasonable. In my township, we compromise. We use 4 times the height of the turbine to a property line of an unleased property owner, 1/4 mile to the house of a leased property owner. The big distances could be reduced with a waiver, and that makes it very fair and very defensible in court. And the 2,000 foot in this draft ordinance for Ingersoll Township is a good number for the property line, but I would change it to a multiple of turbine height. And here's why. If you get sued by a developer claiming exclusionary zoning and you're using a multiple of turbine height, it can't ever be exclusionary. Because your defense in court is, well, Your Honor, at 5 times the height, if they built 80-foot turbines, I see that they could build 30 in a section. Just because they're insisting on 500-foot turbines doesn't mean you have to accommodate that. So I would strongly recommend a multiple of turbine height. Again, equitable wind energy zoning should be established from the property line. It should not donate unleased private property to the neighboring farmers or landowners' tenants. The 2-stage setback is the key. By putting big setbacks to a property line and small setbacks to a leased house, now every one of you has to be approached by the wind company. Every one of you has an equal footing from which to negotiate the value of your own loss of amenity that's associated with wind development. I know of nothing more fair than that. Instead of 5 planning commissioners trying to read all your minds and determine for you yes or no, by shifting this to this approach, big setbacks and small ones with waivers, then you all get to decide. That's fair. That's abundantly fair. How loud is too loud, and who do you believe? This is the other really controversial part. I will hurry up because I'm sure my voice is getting cumbersome by now. Here's, I forget, 73 people living with just 14 turbines in Big Bay, Denok, in the Garden Peninsula in the UP, signed this petition demanding relief from just 14 turbines. There's been litigation there, and it doesn't get better. The wind company will like to tell you, well, look, give us a 40 or 50 decibel noise ordinance. It's no different than a refrigerator or normal conversational speech. What they don't tell you is if you go out at night in most part of your townships, you're only going to hear somewhere between 20 and 30 decibels of noise. So to raise it from 20 or 25 decibels up to 50, you're going to raise the noise threshold about a factor of 8, because that's how it works logarithmically. 55 decibels is far louder than what you hear at quiet nights. The other thing we learned by sound studies is wind turbines make their worst noise from midnight until 4 a.m. statistically, because the wind blows the hardest, and yet that's also when we get wind shear and quiet. The wind can blow hard enough at a loft to keep the turbines at near full power, even if you don't feel much wind at the ground. That's when you hear the noise the worst. And when you're asleep at night and trying to rest, that's when your ears have relaxed and are most prone to be bothered by it. That's why the wind companies will want to take you on tours to their projects, particularly in July and August, because statistically wind turbines produce very little energy in July and August. And if you're there on an August day and you see a turbine spinning like this, you're going to say, well, I don't hear much. Yeah, but it's not at full power and you're not hearing it at its worst. The World Health Organization studied whether or not noise of any type can cause health impacts. Basically, once you get above 40 decibels, 40 to 55, you start to see adverse health effects of any kind of noise. Wind turbines are no different, and there's a lot of studies that show that wind turbine noise is more obnoxious than other types because it's impulsive and has a big low frequency component. And from 55 and up, there's a lot of health impacts. George Hessler does a lot of work for the wind industry. His son, I think, works for a couple of the wind companies in the Thumb, doing noise studies for them, but the state of Minnesota asked him to look at guidelines for noise. And they said an ideal design goal is to keep it at 40 decibels or less outside all residences. My only disagreement is I think it should be property lines, but 50 and 45 are too high. Independent acoustician Robert Rand looked at my township's ordinance, which at one point had 45 decibels. Says those are the same levels that are resulting with litigation on the East Coast. And curiously, the Ontario Ministry of, this is a quote from NextEra Energy's Canadian website. And they said the Ontario Ministry of Environment sound guidelines for rural areas establish maximum permissible sound levels at residents of 40 decibels. And then they go a step farther. They say, which is consistent with the standards set by the United States Environmental Protection Agency. So NextEra Canada says we work to a 40 decibel noise limit, and that's what the US EPA would recommend. But in Tuscola, Sanilac, and Huron County, they demand 55 decibels. I mean, I don't write next to Air Canada stuff. 40 decibels is the right number, and your noise ordinance should have that number in it. I will skip over this in the interest of time. Bottom line, we use the 40 decibel nighttime only noise limit. I see that Spicer's work for your township recommends daytime, nighttime limits. I would move the nighttime one for non-participants to 40. We added some low frequency noise protection. And I'm now starting to recommend a 40 decibel LA max rather than LEQ. We don't need to go into the details on it here, but it's just much easier to enforce. It's a basic, exceed it by 1/10 of a dBA and you're in violation. It's like a speed limit. If you're doing 80 and a 65 and the cop pulls you over, you can't argue, yes, but if you average my speed over the last hour, officer, I was only doing 57 miles per hour. That's the difference between LEQ and LA max. LA max is 66 and a 65, you're culpable. Now, one last thing on property values. I don't talk about this a lot, but if the wind companies come to your community at all, they hand these out like candy and have since 2008. It's the home study that says there's no statistical evidence of loss of property values from wind development. What they don't tell you is about this interview that was done with the author where he says, I think one of the things that often happens is that wind developers put our report forward and say, look, property values aren't affected. And that's not what we would say specifically. On the other hand, they have little ground to stand on if they say we won't guarantee that. We can't require a property value guarantee in Michigan, is my understanding of the zoning law, but responsible developers should be offering a property value guarantee to you. If they really believe that wind turbines don't affect property values, what's the harm? What's the risk to them? There's only 3 studies, by the way, that show basically no loss of property values. The wind company, in fact, I saw a quote in the newspaper today from Detroit Edison saying there are no peer-reviewed studies showing any evidence of loss of property values associated with wind development. And they point to the home study more than anything. Well, they left out these other 11 that do show a loss of property values, and this chart doesn't even show the one from that radical right-wing economic hit group funded by the Koch brothers and Donald Trump, the London School of Economics, which showed an 11% loss of property values from proximity to wind development. Pardon, somebody said? Within 2 miles, with up to 2 miles, yes. We see it ranges from 11 to 40% loss of property values depending on proximity. And I would tell you, if you have resort communities, right, where people are paying $500,000 for a fancy lake house, your property value losses are going to be a lot worse than if you have a $55,000 rental house that is an afterthought on a little 1-acre house lot where the farm has been sold off, right? I mean, it's just a statistical difference there. So how far can you go with zoning? The wind guys will say it's exclusionary. The letter I addressed yesterday from Detroit Edison accused a township again of exclusionary zoning. I don't want to dig into it too deeply, but the bottom line is, first, the wind company has to show there's a demonstrated need for the use in your community. And secondly, just because you adopt strong regulations on something doesn't mean you've become exclusionary. Curiously, we now have a ruling on point for this very topic from last week or the week before, where NextEra sued Elmer Township. The judge says, I gotta walk over here again. The judge says, wind turbines produce energy, which is of course needed by the Elmer Township community, but NextEra's Tuscola wind project cannot reasonably argue that the township will have inadequate access to energy absent the wind energy project. His point was, it can't be exclusionary. You have electricity, so there's no demonstrated need for more generation in your township. Despite that loss, just a week and a half ago, the wind companies are still running around telling naive townships that if you adopt regulations we don't like, it's illegal exclusionary zoning. I know of only one lawsuit particularly on point with the exclusionary zoning. It was kind of a part of the Elmer Township. Bottom line is, one was thrown out of court for not having standing, and NextEra has now lost the first round in Elmer Township. You will hear a lot of threats of litigation. I hear it in every community. In my township, they flew lawyers in from Colorado Springs. They brought them down from Farmington Hills and from Grand Rapids and said, give us our ordinance or we're going to sue you and you're going to lose. In truth, we adopted strong, reasonable zoning. It was upheld in a referendum, and they left and canceled the leases. That's what happens almost all the time. Wrapping up, Most land use changes are pretty benign, like how small the lot is too small to put a house on, how big should your signs be, et cetera, et cetera. We felt in my township that the change of the nature of the township is so profound by citing 40, 50, 60, 50-story tall turbines in a community that those things should not happen without the consent of all the affected parties and without the ability of them to negotiate a value on their loss of amenity. Two-stage setbacks with a waiver option for both noise and distance require the developers to negotiate with all the impacted citizens. It is fair and equitable and reduces community division. Remember, nobody has ever come into your planning board and said, the light coming through my windows is too steady, could you make it flicker once a second? Nobody's ever said that it's too quiet outside my bedroom window, could you raise the nighttime noise threshold from 25 decibels to 55? Nobody's ever said my property values are too stable, could you build some 50-story tall industrial machines next door to put my property values at risk? The old rule of zoning under the Michigan Zoning Enabling Act is this: we were here first, we get to decide. When developers ask communities to adopt zoning that essentially awards free nuisance and safety easements across unleased property, that's called trespass zoning. I think those easements have to be negotiated privately between the developers and all of you. When developers want that decision to be made by your planning board, and you can see board members resign. I've seen a township clerk one time lift her feet off the floor and cover her ears and yell, I can't do this anymore. It's a horrific pressure that people are placed under when they're asked to make these decisions for their whole community. And if you don't understand your rights under the law, you will feel like you have to surrender, and the Michigan zoning law is so strong you do not have to surrender. I would recommend that the Ingersoll ordinance in particular change the distance to a multiple of turbine height, like 4 times. I think the sound language needs to be clarified so that it's very clear that it's referring to property line and not just the house. And I think they should reduce the nighttime level to 40 dBA LEQ. And that's about it. If you want to see our ordinance, it's at raggedtownship.com. That's the ordinance that I like a lot. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Martis. Appreciate your expertise. Next, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. David Mall. Dr. Mall is a PhD from Caltech, 1983, in chemical physics. I'm not even sure what that is. Way smarter than I am. But he's going to talk about ice throw for wind turbine blades, and will use his considerable expertise in that respect.
Okay. How about that? Yep. All right, good. When they say you're a PhD and then you can't run the PA system, that's sort of a problem. I also have to run my computer here, so let's see. We've had some problem with scaling on the screen, so I went through my slides quickly and tried to compress them a little bit so that the things wouldn't run off the side. Kevin, apologize for the problem with yours because there's some good stuff on your slides that we missed. We're going to have a little different flavor of talk here. Appreciate the perspective on the legal and the rights and all the property value things. I'm going to talk instead about some of the problems safety-wise that wind turbines can bring. And I will apologize up front. I'm not an expert on this, but I do like numbers, I do like physics, I like engineering, and sort of did that for a hobby for 30 years until I retired from Dow. And so I've dug into this area a little bit, and certainly welcome to people's comments afterward if you agree or disagree. But I wanted to share some of the things that I've learned in this area. So the title of this is Myth or Menace, and it's ice throw. And you can say, well, what in the world is ice throw? And let me try to explain this to you. If we have a wind turbine, and the blades are moving around in this direction, remember we talked about height. It's a little hard to realize how big that is. It's about 1/10 of a mile high, the tip of the blade. Could be higher, all right? This would be the regulation for proposed height limit for Ingersoll. Could be even higher. What happens as this, since this is so large in diameter, as it rotates, the velocity or speed out at the tip of the blade can be very high. We're talking about greater than 200 miles per hour. You look and you see that thing rotating. It doesn't look like it's that fast, but if you were riding it, it would be a scary ride. 200 miles per hour, maybe 250 miles per hour. And so what you can imagine happen if something is sitting on the tip of that blade and is released, it's propelled in whatever direction the blade was going at 200 miles per hour. And so you can see if it's on the downward stroke, it's thrown at the ground at a great velocity. You would not be wanting to stand right here. If it's on the upward swing, it can be thrown in this direction. And if it's around 45 degrees, plus or minus a little bit, it can be thrown probably the maximum distance. And just for illustration, if we have a house over here with kids playing in the yard, you wouldn't be happy if it threw some objects at them. So the objects we're talking about could be anything. Could be a piece of the blade. But specifically tonight, I wanted to focus on ice. How many of you have been twice at the airport and before, in the winter, before you leave, they do this process called de-icing? That wing does not function well with ice on it. They're trying to remove that ice. So ice builds up on surfaces in the winter. We're in northern climate. So one of the issues is if ice builds up on a turbine surface, it can be released at some random time. Could be thrown at the ground, could be thrown toward your house. So the question is this really a serious problem? Is it a hypothetical problem? Something to worry about in your mind, or is it something that you need to really be concerned about? I'll show you a little bit of information. This is a photograph of a blade tip, obviously with ice on it. So this is the kind of ice we're talking about. Now what you don't see is the scale of this. So these could be pieces of ice that are several feet long, large chunks of ice. They don't look very big when it's a half mile away. Now here's an example of a family in Germany. This was in February this year. This gentleman was out walking and this piece of ice landed about 6 feet from him. And when he looked around, there were other pieces of ice laying around him. And he was 6 feet from basically death. He would have been in the wrong spot. Here's a pickup truck with another little closer look. You can see here's a 8-inch piece of ice. This is a reasonable chunk of ice, maybe weigh a pound or something like that. So, is this a recognized problem? Well, you can find various signs that turbine companies put on their property to warn you of things to protect their liability. Here's one specifically says, do not pass this point for your safety. Of course, there's some snowmobiles that are going past that already. Ice and other heavy objects can be thrown long distances from wind turbine towers at high velocity and can kill. That's a pretty scary sign. If you look up some numbers, you say, well, how big a piece of ice and how high does it have to fall from before it would kill you? And this is one reference I found. If we have a basic 18-ounce piece of ice that falls 18 feet, hits you in the head, very good chance that you would be killed, would be fatal. Doesn't have to be very high. Now imagine we have a turbine that can throw the ice 2/10 of a mile high. This is a very lethal situation. In reality, it probably reaches terminal velocity if it's falling from that height, so it's not going to go any faster, but terminal velocity is way more than enough it would take to kill you if it hit you in the head. So there's no doubt that it can be lethal. There's another issue that goes along with this. I'll just mention this sort of in passing. This is a turbine collapse here in county. Kevin, you probably know all about this. February 25 of last year. This was in an ice storm. One of the other problems of ice buildup is the turbine blades are pretty much at the limit of material design. So if you put extra weight on there and they get out of balance or whatever, it can cause the blades themselves to fail mechanically, or in this case, the whole tower went down. So that's another